Good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and start because there's so much we want to do in this session that I want to use every second we can. Welcome to the session, Reframing Immigrants and Immigration, the Promise and Possibility. I'm Chris Gutierrez, and I'll have the pleasure of chairing this session. And this is a presidential session, one of the few perks you still get when past president. But when they asked me to think about a session of immigration, I really wanted to invite people who didn't give the same narrative about immigrants and immigration. People whose work was always pushing to think about how to study and how to represent exactly what our title says, the promise and possibility of immigrants, to think about the resources that come from having immigrant populations, to help us understand the repertoires of practice that they bring here and they leverage, and to actually push back on prevailing narratives, not only in the public discourse, but in research as well. So it was a pleasure to invite such an august group of people whose work I know deeply, and people who I also know deeply, who I know are really committed to doing this kind of work. And true to my own orientation, it had to be interdisciplinary so that we could think about how we were talking about this across not just education, but people who actually, as their training, study immigration, right? So with that being said, the panel really brings that I think embodies that criteria and brings that sensibility to their work. So I'm going to very briefly just tell you who they are. They have massive amounts of honors and publications that I will not detail. It would take the whole session. But we're going to begin with our distinguished colleague, sociologist Ruben Rambat from the University of California, Irvine, whose topic title is A Permanently Unfinished Story, The Transformation of Immigrant America. He will be followed by, Vilma, are you going next? Yes. By Professor Vilma Ortiz from UCLA, who I had the pleasure of working with for many years. And her presentation will be on Mexican Americans and intergenerational progress. Our third presentation is from Lisa Patel from Boston College, whose work with youth is really kind of helping us rethink immigrant youth and the kind of work that they do across practices and the kind of identities they develop. And so her work will talk about learning from newcomer youth, visions of intelligence. Our final speaker will be my dear colleague, Margie Falstich-Oriana from UCLA, whose wonderful work on translation will be elaborated in her talk, The Transcultural Competencies of Immigrant Youth, Lessons for a Globalized Future. And finally, last but not least, we are so fortunate to have Professor Guadalupe Valdez from Stanford University, whose own work has shaped the way we think about language and the linguistic practices of immigrant youth, bilingual learners, in ways that have just not only defined the field, but continue to push us to think about it in new ways. So how lucky we are to have this wonderful panel. With that, let me turn it over to Ruben, because I always know he has something important to say.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to Chris and to Barbara Schneider for inviting me to this session. I don't know if what I'll have to say is important, but I know that what I'll have to say is fast, because we only have 17 minutes, and this is going to feel like doing tweets with history. And I don't know how much that will work, but here we go. As I mentioned to Chris when we first talked about this session, the subtitle of my talk today, The Transformation of Immigrant America, is a double entendre because it refers to two permanently unfinished realities. First, of course, the country that is being transformed by immigration, and second, it refers also to our book by the same title, Immigrant America, that I wrote with Alejandro Portes, which itself has had to keep changing with every new edition to try to keep up with a world on the move. The book, in other words, is not only a study of the odysseys of millions of newcomers to the United States, but it has itself been an odyssey. We began to write that book over 30 years ago, between the Mariel boat lift and the passage of IRCA in 1986, at a time of compassion fatigue and heightened concern over undocumented immigration from Mexico, in the heyday of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement and of less visible flows of tens of thousands of escapees from murderous wars in Central America, who were not deemed bona fide political refugees in the United States in the context of the Cold War. Not long before we started that book in 1970, and you can probably begin to see that if you look at 1970 in this particular chart, the U.S. Census had found that the foreign-born population accounted for only a little over 4% of the total U.S. population. That was the lowest proportion since 1850, when it first recorded the country of birth of U.S. residents. But in the preface to the first edition of our book, of Immigrant America, we noted that after a lapse of half a century, this permanently unfinished society, that word permanently, that term we borrowed from Nathan Glazer, was being transformed yet again by immigration. Already then, we had been systematically studying the phenomenon for years. Indeed, we had lived it, but could not foresee with precision just how unfinished a society it was, or how transformed it would become, or how dramatically the larger world would change. In every subsequent edition of Immigrant America, one per decade, with the fourth edition now in press, and it's going to come out in a couple of months, we have had to bring this extraordinary story up to date. Indeed, as longtime participant observers of immigration, we have seen changes cascade, not trickle, in each of the preceding decades. That is what I'm going to have to try to tweet now in 15 minutes. But I will say this: history does not repeat itself, but it echoes. Immigration is a transformative force, producing profound and unanticipated social changes in both sending and receiving societies, in intergroup relations within receiving societies, and among the immigrants themselves and their descendants. Immigration is followed predictably not only by acculturative processes on the part of the immigrants, especially of the young, but also by state policies that seek to control the flows, and by varying degrees of nativism and xenophobia on the part of established residents who may view the alien newcomers as cultural or economic threats. In addition, immigration engenders ethnicity, collectivities who perceive themselves and are perceived by others to differ in language, religion, race, national origin or ancestral homeland, cultural heritage, and memories of a shared historical past. Their modes of incorporation, and I'll try to say a few words about that in the time I've left, across generations, and Vilma will be addressing the Mexican story in that regard in just a moment, may take a variety of forms, some leading to greater homogenization and solidarity within the society or within segments of the society, others to greater ethnic differentiation and heterogeneity. Now, if you look at that first chart, and the evolution of the foreign-born population to date from 1900, in fact, you can stretch it back a couple of decades to 1880, and we can discern three major phases, if you will, of U.S. immigration over the last century and a third. The first, from 1880 to 1930, those 50 years, might be called, it's the phase or the period of the great European waves of that time, accompanying the American Industrial Revolution, which reached a historic zenith in 1910, as you see in the chart, when 14.7% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. That is the highest point it has ever been at. It hasn't been topped since. It's at about just over 13% today. This phase ended with the triumph of restrictionist legislation, passed especially in the 1920s. It was a period that encompass the reaction after World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Red Scare, the Palmer raids, eugenics, scientific racism, the nativism of that period, and so on. Now, when the market crashes in 1929 and the Great Depression ensues, you see the period there, you see this big trough in the graph from 1930 to 1970. It's a period that Doug Massey and others have called the long hiatus. And in fact, the decade of the 1930s, so more people actually leave the United States and came into the United States. It's the only decade that has ever happened in U.S. history. And so that period of retrenchment, if you will, from 1930 to 1970 spanned the Great Depression. It also spanned mass deportations and so-called repatriations of Mexicans during the 30s, the Bracero program that began in 42 and went on all the way till 64, and until finally it reached a historic nadir in 1970, where you see that the lowest proportion of the foreign-born ever registered, 4.7%, was recorded at that time. And the third is our contemporary phase, contemporary period of rebound from 1970 to the present, which has also been an era of economic restructuring, of widening economic inequality, and increasingly so, and the sharply increased migration of low-wage workers, professionals, entrepreneurs, refugees, and asylees, reaching, as you see in 2010, 40 million people foreign-born, or almost 13% of the total national population, and counting. This is another way of portraying just the last decade. As you can see, from 2000 to 2010, the foreign-born population has been growing by about 1 million a year. But although you can see that by about 2007 to 8, with the Great Recession and the Great Expulsion, which is what The Economist said on a cover just a few weeks ago, referring to the mass historic deportations in the United States during this period, has slowed down, especially undocumented immigration, slowed down to net zero after about 2008. But legal immigration certainly is still continuing. The ethnic transformation is reflected in the principal national origins of immigrants to the United States. Today, this pie chart shows you the 10 largest immigrant countries, beginning with Mexico, which accounts for the lion's share of 29% of those 40 million. Now it's around 43 million plus today. Followed by China. That percentage of 5% also includes the Taiwanese. If it didn't include the Taiwanese, India has actually just barely surpassed China and the Philippines. El Salvador, now at 3%. As you'll see in just a moment, the number of Salvadoran immigrants has now surpassed the number of Cuban foreign-born in the United States, which is something that has gone largely unnoticed, and it happened already a decade ago. Followed by Vietnam, Cuba, Korea, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. Just a moment's reflection will let you know that even though immigrants come to the United States from over 200 countries and territories, and they all have the same equivalent 20-some thousand visas a year that are allotted, etc., not every country sends equivalent numbers to the United States. Those 10 countries that you see there account for about 60% of the total 40-some million people, immigrants in the United States. And they are countries that have specific historical ties with the United States. In almost every case except India, they involve neo-colonial or interventions on the part of the United States. With Mexico, we can spend an entire day talking about that, although half of Mexico, including California, where I come from, was grabbed by the United States in 1848. The Philippines was a direct colony of the United States for 50 years until it gained its independence on the 4th of July, 1946. It was given its independence. And then, of course, wars in Korea, wars in Vietnam, the Cold War with Cuba that is still continuing to this day, U.S. interventions in the so-called civil wars of El Salvador and Guatemala in the 80s, and in the case of Guatemala, a CIA coup in 1954 that deposed a democratically elected president in Guatemala, and so on. it's not simply immigrants sitting somewhere and deciding, oh, I want to come to the United States because the wages are higher there, and the United States is minding its own business, doing nothing, and they come and they invade us, which is part of what the story goes. Part of the ethnic transformation that is formed by these migrations has been the creation by the Census Bureau and by official statisticians and so on of categories to try to administratively categorize all these people. The category Hispanics is the only so-called ethnicity created by law in the United States, by public law in 1976. If you try to go back in time, around 1950, the so-called, what would now be called the Hispanic or Latino population of the United States may have been around 4 million. And that was before the big Puerto Rican migrations of the 50s, etc. By 2003, the census announced that Hispanics had surpassed African Americans to become the largest minority in the United States, with over 40 million people at that time. In 2010, Hispanics were counted at 50.5 million, and that's not including the 4 million U.S. citizens on the island of Puerto Rico who can come back and forth as they will. It is projected that at current rates of growth, the Hispanic population of the United States will hit 86 million or so by 2030 and 133 million by 2050. At that time, it will almost account for 30% of the total population of the U.S. It already accounts for 17% of the total population. A note on language, in passing, the census began asking its language question for persons 5 years or older in 1980. In 1980, 11% of the population, 23 million people, said that a language other than English was spoken in their home. By 2010, that number is now 60 million people that say they speak a language other than English at home, or 20% of the population. Of course, how well they speak that language is another matter. The census is not interested in that. The census is just interested in how well they speak English. And a note on religion, while we're talking about diversity and the transformations wrought by immigration, Protestant, which was never a homogeneous category, it's composed of dozens of disparate denominations and of fundamentalist, apostolic, and evangelical varieties. Protestants are actually a vanishing majority in the United States today. It actually fell below 50% in 2005. And if you look at the U.S. Supreme Court, there's not a single Protestant in the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. Where do these 40 million people settle? If you take a look at this particular chart, you have the first, second, and third states of principal settlement, and starting with Mexico, you can see how India is a little, and the Philippines are a little larger than China once you take Taiwan out of the equation there. And it's California, 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 and so on. You have the Cubans in Florida and the Dominicans in New York, but other than that, the top 10 are a California story. And then you see the secondary and tertiary. I'm going to be really hustling. This is another way of looking at the concentration in states and metropolitan areas of immigrants. The only state where more than 25% of the population is foreign-born is California, as you can see there. And then Los Angeles. And to give you a sense of how extraordinary the transformation, the ethnic transformation has been, as late as 1960, Los Angeles was the whitest, most Protestant city in the United States, with the lowest percentage of immigrants of any major city in the United States. 1960. By 2007, Los Angeles County, which is the largest county in the United States with 10 million people, the census announced that 7.1 million people, or 71% of its county population, consisted of ethnic minorities. 71%. 7.1 million is larger than the populations of most states. And that's the ethnic minority population of Los Angeles County, which not too long before had been anything but. But then take a look at what is going on lately. Back in the 1980s, California itself was a, quote, new destination. You know, a lot of people talk about new destinations today, new destinations in North Carolina and in Georgia and in places that had not been used to receiving immigrants in the past, which are those yellow states that you see there. The blue states are what these days are considered the the traditional gateways, the principal states of immigration to the United States. Like California and Texas, Florida, Illinois is really Chicago, and then, but they have to put the blue on the entire state, and then, and the same for New York and New Jersey, which is really the New York metro area, it's not upstate New York. Although now changes are happening there's even Mexican restaurants in, what is Sarah Palin's little town in Alaska? Wasilla, there's a Mexican restaurant there. So even in Alaska and Hawaii, the Mexicanization of the United States, as an unintended consequence of militarizing the border, by the way, it's a story that I won't be able to get into now. Okay, so you can see the numbers for the top states of immigration, beginning with California, and compare 1990 to 2010, and look at those rates of growth. North Carolina has grown in the foreign-born by 525%, Georgia by 445%, and so on. So they have the largest rates of growth. But California alone has grown from 6 million to 10 million over that 20-year period, at only a modest 55% of growth, but those 4 million are more than the total number of immigrants in all of the 10 states of rapid growth combined. So keep that in mind. Now there are a couple of main things I want to conclude with, given the education as a central concern not only of the AERA but of Immigrant America. One is this particular chart that you see there. That shows you the levels of education of immigrants to the United States today, the 40 million, ranked by the percent of adults 25 and over that have 4-year college degrees or higher. The most educated people in the United States today, foreign-born or native-born, are immigrants. The least educated people in the United States by far in the U.S. today are also immigrants. And you can see those that are above average and those that are below average there, especially if you have very good eyesight. I'm sorry that I don't have time to go one by one, but I will focus on the top 10 and take a look at this. Here I look at two things. Levels of education, especially those with college graduate degrees or less than a high school education, the far two columns. And in the middle columns, the percent of these top countries of immigration who are undocumented, and then you have the actual numbers on the left columns. I highlight for you three main modes of incorporation. There are groups, including the largest one of all from Mexico, but also El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, that are characterized by low levels of education. These are, after all, low-wage laborers by and large, although they also include physicians and dentists and so on, but by and large. And you can see there the majority of them are undocumented. The majority of all of those millions of immigrants from Mexico and Central America are, over 50-some%, are undocumented. They have many children that are born in the United States who are citizens, but the majority of the immigrants are undocumented. And if you look at the far right column, more than half of them, almost 60% of the adults, have less than a high school education. A second mode of incorporation is shown in the middle panel. Here you have brain drain immigration, if you will, professional immigrants. And more than half of them have college degrees, and in the case of those from India, almost 80% of them have college degrees, and many have very advanced degrees, not just 4-year degrees. Masters and doctorates are in the 30% plus, which is higher than the average for the U.S. population generally. And then, interestingly enough, you have almost double digits for each of those countries also have undocumented immigrants among them. They don't cross on foot, they come with visas, and then they overstay those visas, and they do so because to stay in the famous queue would take 35 or 45 years in some cases for some preferences in U.S. law, so they just come in and overstay their visas. About 40% of the undocumented population consists of visa overstayers. And finally, the last ones are refugees who get refugee status when they come. I'm just going to end with some images. The kosher burrito was invented in Los Angeles in the 1980s, and that's what it looked like in the 1980s. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, the candidate who won the mayor's race in Los Angeles called himself the kosher burrito, He's the first Jewish mayor of Los Angeles, but he's of Mexican and Italian ancestry on his father's side, and he went around calling himself the kosher burrito. That's all very well. In Irvine, where I'm from, in Orange County, we're on our second Korean mayor, so you may not know that. But the politics of exclusion are far more important to the way I want to end my remarks today. This is a photo I took in March 2006 when almost 1 million people crammed the streets of downtown Los Angeles to protest for immigrants' rights when the Sensenbrenner bill had just been passed by the House of Representatives that would have made felons of 12 million people at the stroke of a pen and also made felons of anyone who would help them. That was almost 8 years ago now. The paralysis at the national level continues. No comprehensive immigration reform has been passed, but the enforcement mechanism and this kind of picture is what dominates the reality of immigrant America today. The Great Expulsion. This is a woman in February, there's a New York Times photo, looking south, just about to be deported along with others in Nogales, Arizona. This is a quote from my colleague, Doug Massey, from a few months ago. Not since the days of slavery have so many residents of the United States lacked the most basic social, economic, and human rights. And all of this is happening at a time of widening economic inequality. This is a picture for income. I'm sorry that I'm going to flash through this. The top 10% in income already have more than 50% of total income in the United States. And that affects mobility. This chart has been called the Great Gatsby curve by Alan Kruger, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors of the President. As economic inequality goes forward along the horizontal axis, mobility shrinks along the vertical axis. And you see the United States way out there at the top. The United States is no longer the land of opportunity. The idea of mobility is not the part for the course. In fact, it's very unlikely. And then this is a letter that I got. I've been visiting immigrants in prison, in jail, because of their migration status every Friday since last year. This is a letter I got from one that I visited back and forth. We were successful after 9 months to get him released on bond. And within 3 months, while I was taking him to his ICE appointment, we were surrounded by 3 ICE thugs who grabbed him and said they're taking him into custody for no reason whatsoever. That night, I found out that Melitón Navarro was dumped in Tijuana with the clothes on his back, no birth certificate, no nothing, and no one in the United States who could cross the border to bring him the money that he had coming to him the next day, etc. So I ended up doing that, and that's when I snapped this picture at the Casa del Migrante in Tijuana. And then finally, I just got back yesterday the day before from Guadalajara, where La Bestia, those freight trains come that are bringing people, especially young kids from Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, and they cross all of Mexico to different points in the north to see if they can get in. This is a Salvadoran 28-year-old man who has a 10-year-old daughter in New York. He was deported from New York to El Salvador. He was making his way back when, during a rainstorm in Veracruz, he slipped off the train, and that sucks you right under. It severed his leg, broke all his front teeth that you don't see there. He's trying to make it to see his daughter. This demoralized young man, 20 years old, from Guatemala, his companions abandoned him 3 days before, and he's been assaulted by police, robbed, and so on in Mexico, and he's trying to figure out how does he go back home. These are 2 men from Honduras. The one on the left lost his hand when he fell off the train. He's been deported once before. The one on the right is 17 years old. He's making his first trip. And this man, who might be a modern-day Candide, he made it into the Arizona desert, he was lost. He was found by a group that tries to look for them because so many die in the desert. He was taken back to Mexico. He tried again. He was shot at and went all the way back to Honduras. He then got on a train, and as he was going by Tabasco, just north of Veracruz, he was kidnapped by Zetas, who made him work for a month and a half chopping marijuana plants until he finally was allowed to go. He now has gotten as far as Guadalajara, But he has two daughters. He's 19 years old, and he has two daughters in Honduras. He can't go to the U.S. He knows how dangerous that is. He can't go back, so he's going to try to beg on the streets in Guadalajara. That, too, is a permanently unfinished reality. Thank you for your attention.
Get your help. You just need to insert it, right?
Yeah.
Give Ruben back his. I know I did that wrong, but that's.
Okay, so I can't resist to tell you that the oddest place I've seen a Mexican restaurant is in my family's hometown of San Germán, Puerto Rico. Okay, so that's my where to find a Mexican restaurant. I was the most surprised. Okay, so I'm going to shift our attention a little bit and talk about what is it like for a group that enters the United States in incredibly large numbers, which Ruben was referring to, and then what happens subsequently in terms of their generational progress, experience. And I'm going to focus specifically on the educational outcomes because this is, after all, AERA. And I'm going to then try to give you a sense of the structural factors around this immigration and the societal reception that helps us understand these experiences. And so I'm speaking to you as a sociologist, kind of bringing my sociology hat and trying to provide that for understanding this particular community. So Mexican origin folks are incredibly diverse. There's an immigrant, a very large immigrant, first generation, which Ruben, showed you in those numbers about the largest group being Mexican origin. But there's also many U.S.-born Mexican Americans who are part of this community. There has been continuous immigration from Mexico to the U.S. so that you've got people who are from very recent arrivals of just a few years ago to fourth or later generation. And these past experiences and this past history informs the current reality, so that we don't fully know, can't fully understand what's happening today without really seeing this migration in its historical breadth. We study Mexican origin folks and Mexican immigration because it has been the largest, longest, and most continuous of any migration to the U.S. It rivals that of the European groups in the 1800s, the German being the largest or one of the largest. Mexican immigration is as large. It is the largest among contemporary immigration, although recently there's been more Asian immigrants coming in. Still, Mexican immigrants form the largest immigrant group today. And a good part of the reason for this is the proximity. The U.S. shares this long border, 2,000-mile shared border. Mexico is our neighbor. There is a historical, military, colonial, economic relationship in place. So a lot of sociologists, not all, but many, use assimilation as a idea, a concept, a model to understand what happens to groups when they come to the U.S. And there's an assumption, particularly in the early kind of thinking of this model, that newcomers come, they start at the bottom, they work their way, they work really hard to get ahead. It's part of our ideology, like, anybody can make it. And that with this hard work and willingness, there's also this idea that they're supposed to want this. People make steady progress and over several generations are fully integrated into whatever that American mainstream is. And originally it was conceptualized as Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now, this reality actually was achieved mostly for Europeans. European groups were stigmatized and considered not able to assimilate. That was certainly part of the discussion, even the academic discussion about the Italians, for instance, was that they wouldn't be able to fully participate. Still, all European groups that came, Italian, Russians, Polish, had the luxury, the protection of being white in the U.S., and that granted them certain privileges that not all groups that have entered the U.S. were granted. This didn't apply to Chinese and Japanese in the 1800s, but Europeans had this advantage, had this legal protection, and over time did then fulfill the promise of the assimilation model. It is an interesting, not the main part of my presentation today, but early on, assimilation scholars tried to apply this assimilation model to blacks and said that the southern to northern migration was analogous to the European U.S. migration, and that over time there would be this full incorporation. Unsurprisingly, this model as a framework for understanding the experience of African Americans did not work. They dropped it at a certain point. Okay, so today there's been a revision of assimilation theory with the idea that, to kind of think about contemporary immigration and what it looks like. Immigration is a lot more diverse, okay, so you've got folks coming in, some who are highly educated. Ruben shared some of these figures with you, and many who are less educated. There are some groups that are much more positively received. U.S. society thinks of them as groups that are going to contribute to our society. High-tech workers, for instance, who come in with these employment visas, are part of that group. Individuals, as well as the broader society, is welcoming to the idea that they should be part of who we are. Actually, this comes out of Ruben's past work. And also, the idea of who is the mainstream and what are people becoming part of has also changed. It has broadened. It isn't simply that Anglo-Protestant part of society, but really much more Judeo-Christian, European. So groups that early on, like Italians, were thought not to be part of this mainstream, today are fully part of this mainstream. Assimilation, this revised assimilation theory acknowledges that race is part of the story, but doesn't really emphasize it, doesn't prioritize it. So in contrast, there are folks who really think about what happens to particular groups, some of whom are immigrant groups, through a lens of racialization. We understand there's certainly a lot of support for the idea that race stratifies our society and that African Americans are a group that have particularly been impacted by this. And there's a lot of agreement among most sociologists, a few exceptions, that race matters for African Americans. That's not the assumption out there in the real world, though, but certainly the academics who do the research buy this. So then the question becomes, where do Mexican origin folks, Latinos, fit into this assimilation versus race debate? Okay, I'm going to focus on the Mexican origin piece here. The assimilationists respond and say, well, Mexicans, they come with less education, they just need a little more time. And the racializationalists argue Mexicans enter a racial hierarchy that limits their incorporation. And this may somewhat line up with a kind of East-West, East Coast, West Coast kind of distinction of looking at the world. Like if you're in the East Coast and kind of considering what has been a long history of European immigration here, you have a different kind of interpretation of the reality than if you're sitting in the Southwest, California, Southern California, where we've had this very long history of immigration. Okay. So the questions I'm going to address, again, is the educational outcomes, and then kind of go back to these structural factors that that we think affects immigration. I'm pulling data from, I kind of pulled a slide from here and a slide from there and a slide from someplace else, and that's my talk. So some of it is published data that other people have done. Some of it is from my book with Edward Deyes, Generations of Exclusion. And then lastly, I've got some new analysis with Nell's data, which should be very familiar to most of you. And I'm going to mainly focus on education figures, but then a couple of other economic indicators, and most important, I'm going to compare to other groups, later generation whites and blacks. So this is numbers. This was published a number of years ago by Jorge Chapa, a sociologist, who really tackled the question, are third generation Mexican Americans they reached the educational level of whites? This is a historical presentation going back to the 40s till well, not today, because this is kind of up to 1990, but it gives us a picture of the history, right? So there is a lag. There are Mexican Americans in the third generation. The third generation are the folks that we consider the grandchildren of immigrants, still have not reached the level of education of white Americans, and this is true even into the most recent period of 1990. There is still more than a year gap. So in our book, Deyes and I also present similar figures, and here I'm showing you first the numbers that you can't see. That's on purpose. I'm going to show them to you next. So first, the numbers I want you to look at are kind of the first generation to second generation. Yes, immigrant Mexicans come with very low levels of education. 7 years of education is is on average. It's not surprising. It's based on a very different educational system in Mexico, and it's based on who is kind of recruited and pulled into the U.S. economy. And there is this sharp increase. The children of immigrants do a lot better. They get 10 years of education. That's impressive. The third generation does not do a lot better than the second. And when we add in these other numbers of kind of comparing to whites, and then also comparing to even the first set of numbers I presented were kind of older folks, so that's our project has kind of these two cohorts of older respondents, and then their adult children who are kind of a younger cohort. So even among the younger cohort, there's an increase from their parents, but there is not this steady increase by generational status. So my focus is really, is the increase by generational status, does it look like what we expected it to be? And therefore, is it close to what white Americans are enjoying? And for each cohort, we compare them kind of to folks who are similar to them in age among the whites. There is a gap, right? So for that later cohort, it's on average about 12 and a half years of schooling versus 14 years of schooling for whites. So let's get even to the most recent young adults today, those who are age 26 in the year 2000 from Nell's data, and we still see this lagging behind in the educational experience for third generation Mexican origin. And looking at the college is such an important part of what will allow you to participate fully in the U.S. society. It is a college degree that is going to allow you to possibly enter the middle class today, right? High school degrees aren't making it. And we see large numbers of Mexican origin go to college, but still much fewer graduate college. And so this is where the educational disadvantage continues till today, in this century among young adults, 14 to 15% of Mexican Americans finish college in comparison to more than a third of white later generation. Now these numbers look somewhat low, and part of it is because some of these 26-year-olds will finish eventually. There's always a small group that continues their education into their late 20s and 30s. Okay. So what is it? Let me just kind of throw out what is the question? Anyway, let me address the issue of what if we control for a bunch of background factors that these groups differ on, like Mexican origin youth have parents with less education. And if we control for a bunch of background things, including the kinds of schools they attended and so on, do we see a reduction in the educational difference that I've been showing you kind of in just cross-section in unadjusted numbers? So this is from a multivariate analysis. And here we see that third generation, even after controlling for a bunch of things, the third generation does significantly less than whites. And the second generation, we explain all of that difference, and part of that is because their parents are the immigrants, and the immigrant parents have exceptionally low education. But the third generation are the children of the second, and the second generation gets to high school. And, you know, that helps that third generation somewhat, but not enough to really reach the level of what white young adults have, the opportunities they have. Okay. I'm going to skip a couple of things. I had numbers on occupational status, which show very much the same thing, and earnings over age, like from age 19 to 26. I'm going to skip those and get to and summarize so that I'm within my time limit. So we see between the first and second generation, there's this incredible increase in education, right? This is taking, yes, the second generation, the children of immigrants are able to take advantage of certain educational opportunities in the US that their parents who were raised in Mexico, where there were fewer education opportunities and who came because they were less educated, did not have. But then beyond that second generation, education levels off. Third and fourth generation do not experience the steady increase in their educational level that we would expect based on predictions of assimilation theory. And this is not simply a recent pattern, this has been a pattern for more than half of a century. Mexican Americans play a very important role in our economic system, especially in the Southwest, but now this is a national phenomenon. The migration has moved east, north, all of the eastern coast has settlements of Mexican immigrants, and they are largely recruited for low-wage, low-status work. Mexican immigrants are very much welcomed into our society during prosperous times. When the economy is good, we want these immigrants. And when the economy is bad, there is this really strong push to send them back, to treat them badly. This is what we saw in the Great Depression with repatriations, which have been referred to, and that we've seen since 2008, the Great Recession, where we've put in place this incredible apparatus of deporting people. And so it is this, and there's other numbers of this kind of back and forth that line up with the economic opportunities here. The educational system is part of the story because the perception and experiences that happen in the larger society, the negative attitude toward Mexican immigrants then plays out in the educational system. We know that Mexican origin youth attend schools that are less resourced, they're tracked out of college-bound courses and programs. They are subject to the lower expectations on the part of teachers, and so that all this together, this kind of environment, school environment, sets in place low expectations and less support for Mexican American young adults. In contrast, what an idea about, or considering the racialization argument, really helps us understand the experience of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. There is a racial hierarchy in the US. Mexicans are clearly positioned below that of European Americans. This is not an argument about whether they're better or worse than blacks. That's not where this is going. It is really an argument about where they don't fit relative to what is the group that is most privileged in society. And this negative attitude, perception, and therefore racialization is not just directed at the immigrants, the workers, the ones who come to do that low-wage, low-status work, but also at the later generations. And this is what we call in sociology a process of racialization. Thank you.
As I'm pulling this up, this presentation, I want to thank Professor Gutierrez deeply for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's definitely an honor. I want to also acknowledge, before I get too far into this, presenter view.
She got it.
I like your slide.
Thank you. Well, that's me, Lee Patel. I want to also acknowledge that we're meeting this meeting, like all of the AERA meetings, as many scholars like Eve Tuck reminds us, that these happen on traditional indigenous lands, and we're meeting on the Nai Lenape traditional land here. It's always good to do this. I do it particularly in this session because when we're talking about migration, we're talking about movement and relationship to land. So I wanted to begin that way and also bring in land at the end. Land and place matters. I want to talk with you a little bit about a space that I've been working on and in for the past 5 to 7 years, roughly. And so I'm going to get really, really up close with some conversations with newcomer youth and the ways that we use a space and privilege a space to talk about the different versions of intelligence that we have within us, located in families, located in people in schools, located in people outside of schools, and how necessary these spaces are to have alongside the ways that newcomer youth and migrant youth are understood in schooling spaces. So a lot of the texture, the dialogue, the detail that I'm going to be talking about with you today comes from a space that uses the front of an internship. So we all have names and badges here in AERA. I work to get internships for the youth that I work with, and so if they're still enrolled in school, if they haven't been pushed out of school or aged out of school, documented, undocumented from various different nations, all newcomer youth though, for one day of school, they don't go to school. Instead, they go to an internship in the morning, and then in the afternoons, we have basically breakdown sessions where we talk about race, class, language, intelligence, what looks like intelligence. We do a lot of collective meaning making. So it's in those sessions that the dialogue, the sharings, the motions, the gestures that I'm going to be talking about with you today, it comes from these sessions, not so much the morning internship time. So in these sessions, which I've tried to design deliberately to privilege the various forms of intelligence that migrants have by virtue of experientially what they've gone through in the world, for good and for bad. We always have this question going on in our conversations. Who is the smartest person that you know? So this is such a great question, right? Who's the smartest person that you know? And it's there's one cohort in particular that is going to be that you're going to be hearing some of the words from. There's one young woman in this cohort, Erlene, a young woman from Haiti, that she'd been pretty quiet in most of our cohort meetings. And when I asked her this question, who's the smartest person that you know? She thought about it and she said, my father. And this came as a surprise to many of us when she said this, because she had, not too long ago, when she had spoken up one time, she was talking about how her father, her family coming from Haiti, had left her mother and her 2 younger sisters to move from their smaller village in Haiti to Port-au-Prince. And she talked about some issues of abandonment there. So we were all a little bit surprised when she said, my father, when asked who's the smartest person that you know. And she sees us looking at her and listening to her. And she says, you want to know why he's so smart? He is smart because he always knows how to make whoever he is talking to feel like the most special person in the world. He has a restaurant, like a small one, but people always come there because they know him, and he remembers everything about them. We're all still listening. She says, but that's not it. You know what makes him smart? He doesn't tell them too much about himself. So he is this nice kind of man who is so friendly. And they leave feeling good, but they don't know too much about him. That is smart, and nobody teach you how to do that in school. So we enter into what counts as intelligent by starting with mirrors, with versions of intelligence from any context, family, school, self. We look at it from a variety of perspectives, and we are precise about what that intelligence is. And particularly in this example, if that is an ethical intelligence, if this person that Erlene has a mixed relationship, her father who she feels abandoned her family, if that kind of intelligence that he's displaying is the kind of intelligence we want to privilege, one that we want to have ourselves, those are the kind of more discrete questions we apply to this. These kinds of conversations where we talk about the intelligence in our lives, in our own faces when we look in the mirror is so vital, because coming from the field of education, we talk so much about this increasing diversity. We talk about statistics, many of which are less precise than the ones that Professor Rombal gave us at the beginning of this session. But we talk about the increasing diversity in schools, and immigrant youth are almost the poster children for this increasing diversity. We don't often get to more precise conversations about where those flows are. Again, Professor Rombal's presentation much better with even tinier words I have in mind for it. That's basically trying to get at the flows of people across different locations. We don't get to that because we just talk about the increasing diversity. We have policies that frame it in particular ways for us. This policy, as an example, first tells us that we're talking about English language learners, not migrant youth. And by that, they are framed in terms of their language fluency in standardized academic English, or more precisely, lack thereof. And of course, they are English language learners. But this framing of it here, adolescent or young migrants, works from what Eve Tuck indicts in her 2000 Harvard Educational Review publication, The Letter to Communities, in which she implores indigenous communities to suspend the damages narrative, not because damages don't exist, and here, not because English language learning isn't important, but when it's the only frame through which we can understand ourselves, that is the deficit frame. And it also locates salvation perhaps from an external expert. Here, the salvation coming from somebody, usually a US-born monolingual native speaker of standardized academic English, as being the one who can help in this situation. It doesn't take into account the repertoires of practice that Gutierrez, Rogoff, and Oriana and others have documented that young immigrants, older immigrants, young adult immigrants use and leverage out of that learning space. It doesn't see the learning space itself as generative. The second thing that this framing does that makes these conversations about versions of intelligence so vital, the second thing that's going on in this framing, it works from this premise of whiteness, meaning that it surreptitiously presents these societal structures as equitable, and thereby locates a disenfranchisement of racially minoritized and low-income populations as lacking, in fact, twice as much. We even have a somewhat of a mathematical foundation for that here. But twice as much as whom? Implicitly, but pretty obviously here, X, the twice as much as, the double the work, X are US-born monolingual students who speak standardized academic English, again, as their mother tongue. This framing works from the fervent epistemology of American social mobility. And in this epistemology of American social mobility and meritocracy, rules are transparent. Hard work, do your best, follow the rules, wait in that queue, do double the work if that's what it requires, and social mobility will open itself up to you. That kind of belief, that kind of ideology is a structure, and it structures the way we understand, pursue certain kinds of statistics and how we understand statistics about dropouts. It also frames our responses to these. That through a white stream logic, as Sandy Grande talks about it, that drives research policy and practice, erroneously but still pervasively asserting that those who are failing are doing so not because of a systemic inability to simply see their intelligences, but because they lack X, maybe even 2X, like the prior slide, or 3X. So the highest achieving populations are studied for what traits they exhibit, and those constructs are applied as a deficit downward and as a justificatory award upward. What's missing from these frames is a recognition that the United States has more than an achievement gap and an education debt, as Gloria Ladson-Billings put it in her presidential address to this professional organization. But without the widespread knowledge and praxis from a reckoning with the historical and ongoing educational debt here and elsewhere, it is vital for migrants and other systemically vulnerabilized communities to have mirrors of their own intelligence so that they are not as much at the whim of a mirror that doesn't have any place for them. So that is why we began with this question. Left to the devices of schooling as a structure in a nation that operates on a mythology of meritocracy, individual merit, and competition, that will have them believing that they are not skilled at all, we have to create spaces where they can see themselves as skilled, articulate that, perform that into those spaces. So we discuss versions of intelligence that we and others exhibit, as Arlene did, how and why they are recognized as such, what is problematic about those intelligences, as Paris and Alim have encouraged in their recent work on critically sustaining and relevant pedagogy. We also pay attention to the ways that intelligence may be misread or altogether unseen from more mainstream views. And we look for examples of how that is refused, modified, and remixed on its own terms. In essence, trying to learn from what Mike Rose has been writing about for so long, the ways that intelligence and work are talked about in very funky ways in American discourses. And this is particularly salient for so many migrant populations. But refusing it when that intelligence is not necessarily contained in the question that's being posed to us. This was one example that we talked a lot about in that cohort that Arlene was in. This is Edwidge Danticat. This is a picture from the New York Times that profiled her and her writing room at home, which is so lovely, right? And her babies, obviously. We read a couple of her books, including Farming the Bones and Create Dangerously Together. So we read and we listened to an interview with her. In one of those interviews, Ms. Danticat was asked by a reporter from the New York Times what book she grew up with and what her memories were being read to as a child. Because we know that that's how you come to be a literate person, right? You have books in your home as a child, and some adult sits you on their lap and reads aloud to you. We know that to be truth, right? Okay. So she said, I think quite generously, reoriented the question through her answer. And she said, I didn't grow up with a lot of books, actually. Some. I owned actually only one non-school book before I was 12. I was not read to as a child. Instead, I was told fabulous stories by my aunts and grandmothers and many family friends. But without the spaces for us to recognize the intelligence in our lives, the ways that we are drenched, as Ms. Danticat is talking about, some of our experiences in abundantly communicative settings, we could potentially get it twisted when we're asked a question like, so you must have been read to as a child, what was your favorite book? We have to be able to know fluently and with detail the intelligence in our own lives, in our families' lives, in the lives of the people around us, in order to see how it's not contained initially in the frame that's provided to us, to interrupt that frame and modify it. So we have a lot of different mirrors. We read from a lot of different sources. We think about, are we reflected in this text? Who is reflected in this text? And we try to have that imaginative metal. But mirrors are not enough. And I want to share with you just one more really, really thick conversation from this same cohort of young people. In this cohort, I bring in some text. I ask the young people to bring in some text that are always guided by this question of, does this represent you? Does this represent me? Where do we see ourselves in different texts? One young person brought in a song by the Blues Scholars that I don't have enough time to play for you, but you should really listen to it because it's just really good. And one part of the song, this is some of the lyrics that I definitely will not do a horrible thing to and read them aloud to you. And afterwards, we were talking about it. And Elvis, who's a young migrant from the Dominican Republic who has legal documentation to be in the United States, he says, it says that people divided, but to be honest, that's not right. Like in my country, the DR has been claiming the international community to assist in Haiti's situation. The DR government built universities, bridges, and all that in Haiti. People ignore this. And he's looking around the room because we don't often talk, it hasn't been the pattern to talk about nations in this way. But he continues. I'm starting to believe that the world thinks that the DR is a rich country. We also need the international community to support us, but I don't think that's what the song says, to look after everyone, even us in our difficult situation. I think it only means some. Edine, a young immigrant from Guatemala who doesn't have documentation to be in the United States, he says, man, why are you going off on Haitians? That's like the poorest people around, and you're going to say you deserve more than they do? Elvis responds, I'm tired of all the fingers pointing at the DR. If people care so much about them, why don't they tell them to come to their country? I just think that they are in the country illegally. And if we believe in illegal immigration, then we shouldn't have any borders anywhere, right? I'm secretly getting excited just at that question, but okay. And he says, show me a country that doesn't believe in borders, and then we can talk about how people shouldn't be divided. And he sits back with his arms folded. For a lot of different reasons. Like, he sits back because he knows that what he's saying is not necessarily welcome, certainly by me, perhaps by some of the other young people in the crowd. And so he sits back, I think also to protect himself a little bit, as well as to be like, with a grill. So Erlene, who you heard from a little bit earlier, she says, well, but there is no example of what you are saying. You are acting like borders and countries and people moving is just because they're basically criminals. It's not. You know that half of us here are here because there is no way to live, survive. So we look for some place we can do that. Are you saying that's wrong? It's thick, right? Elvis says, no, I didn't mean about you. I know why you did what you did, but I just think coming together, like in the song, means that people who don't even have anything will have to give up more. I don't know, but something just doesn't feel right. We live in the world that has countries and borders and laws. Are we supposed to ignore that? And with the juggernaut question, which we? And she turns away from Elvis at this point and to the whole group, and then she points back to him and says, we keep asking who we are, but we are different right now. Maybe there is not one we. Yeah. Pausa right there. So, I've been thinking about some of there's been a couple of really, really fantastic recent publications that implore us and help us and guide us to think about critically and culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies that engages with both the problematic and progressive aspects of our communities. And another article in the same issue that came from that pushes us to think about non-homogenizing attention. I think what the conversation between Erlene and Elvis and Nadine pushes us to think about is how do we see that we are different and engage across those differences? How do we not just retreat back into identity groups? Something that the group that I've been working with and through many different iterations have been trying to work with is the idea of manifestos, of asking these questions of who are we, what is our code, to what and to whom are we accountable, answerable, what is our end game and how will we get there? And so they create different manifestos. But one of the last things that I want to close with that I think is so deep in this conversation that Elvis and Nadine and Erlene were having, they all ease, I don't know, sorry, is that there is a larger structure. We can't assume that migrants coming from nations outside of the United States will not necessarily live and breathe and pulse with neo-colonial ideologies and ways of treating each other, defining each other not according to land but to borders, and that's such a key difference. Here the words of Audre Lorde mean so much to me. She was in a conversation with James Baldwin that she posed, we have to figure out how we can look at our differences and not be divided. The last image I want to leave you with is actually a photo from the website of the Black Land Project, which looks at the stories of black people and their relationship to land that, from the view of settler colonialism, contains so much grief and harm. And I think there's a lot in there for us to understand as we look at the potential and possibilities of migrants. If we look at relationships to land, that creates a different way of understanding their experiences, their relationships to each other, their relationships to unfinished projects such as settler colonialism. And that's different than if we look at them through their relationship to borders. And in that is a very subtle but potentially significant way of understanding migrants and lands in relationship with U.S.-born populations. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to I'll probably skip through a few things, and so we have some time for discussion across these really rich papers. And I'll begin just with a very quick thank you to Chris for organizing this panel and all of you for coming out for it. I want to start with this question of how do we begin to get beyond these deficit perspectives that shape so much of our work. So I'm just trying to adjust my glasses and the page here. There we go. So how do we get beyond these deficit perspectives that frame so much of our work? A few years ago, Chris and I wrote a couple of short papers where we noted that most research on immigrants doesn't even address, in schools, most research on educational issues of immigrants doesn't even address students as migrants per se, more focuses on one-dimensional aspects of their identity around, and specifically around language, and generally starts from a deficit perspective. Even when we've shifted from calling people limited English to English learners, there's still an implied deficit. And article after article on research on immigrant youth starts with a problem frame. The problems immigrant students face in terms of acculturation, achievement, and language acquisition. And this is not to diminish the sociological studies of the structural bases and historical patterns that our colleagues here today pointed out so beautifully. We need those structural analyses, but what happens when it gets translated to the level of individuals and becomes projections of educational trajectories? There's also a body of research, I think, that by more critical scholars who seek to counter these deficit perspectives. However, often we seem to do this by saying, don't have a deficit perspective. But when we say don't think that way, what unintentionally maybe we are reinforcing. And George Lakoff is the one who said years ago, don't think of an elephant. When you say that, what do you think of? So non-Western, non-dualist thinking has long understood this point and has expressed it in profound and poetic ways. And I'll let you ponder this quote from the Tao Te Ching. And so as we think about how do we escape these deficit perspectives, how might we as a field start from a different set of assumptions? Ones that do not reinforce the very binaries we want to challenge. What kinds of questions might we ask if we were not trying to fix immigrant youth or get them to fit into the world as it has been constructed by us, adults, but instead learning from them about new possibilities for us all? We might also consider that the experience of being a migrant, of moving and living across in spaces where people from different places meet up, who have diverse repertoires of linguistic and cultural practices, that this is increasingly the norm, both in the US and around the world. And if we start from that assumption that that's normative and take seriously the profoundly cultural nature of learning and development, as Carol Lee beseeched us to do in her presidential address here at AERA a few years ago, we might ask new questions about what it means to grow up, moving across linguistic, cultural, and geopolitical borders, and what competencies are both demanded and developed in cultural context zones. And in this, we're treating culture not as a category of difference, but as a verb, as Chris has called on us to do. It may help to understand culturality as a verb if we put trans in front of it. And I want to argue trans is not just a substitute for inter or multi. Trans suggests a movement beyond borders, a transcendence or transformation of things that were being held apart or artificially constructed as separate and distinct. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary for the prefix trans and for this notion of transcultural, which is not a new term. Fernando Ortiz first used this term in 1940. Fernando was a Cuban scholar who built on the ideas of the poet and philosopher José Martí, and he defined transculturalism as reinventing of a new common culture based on meeting and intermingling of different peoples and cultures. I would argue transculturality is fostered not just by living in Gloria Anzaldua's metaphorical borderlands, and not simply by moving between presumably different cultural worlds, but by efforts made by people in context zones to bring different views together, to grapple with them, to reconcile differences, maybe to translate or mediate between them, and perhaps eventually to transcend those differences and create entirely new ways of thinking. I don't see this as quite the same as hybridity, certainly not the erasure of differences, but more like the resolution of dialectical tensions and the emergence of something new that we perhaps can't even quite imagine. The field, I think, is still working out analytical clarity about what exactly transculturality is, but it is a term you hear increasingly. This is just a few of the ways we hear transcultural used in recent educational research. We also hear translanguaging, and we see documentation of practices that in the past we might have viewed as code switching, or I would have called translation and language brokering, and instead see them as this movement beyond linguistic borders. So my own observations of immigrant youth over a period of years engaged in this practice of language brokering led me to see transculturality in terms of dispositions as well as competencies. The disposition to see things from different culturally informed perspectives, as well as the competencies needed for flexible movement across borders that have been constructed. I won't take you through this, but with Angie Shushawan and Patricia Greenfield, we did ask, is this something we could measure? And we devised a transcultural perspective-taking task that asked young adult children of immigrants to choose one of two culturally laden scenarios. It wasn't so important what they chose. These are arguably essentialized and dichotomized options. But then we said, can you imagine why someone might choose the other option? And we looked at how they responded to that. Were they able to imagine a different way of responding in ways that did not entail judgment, but rather a more cultural lens on understanding why someone could choose that, whether or not they agreed with them? We found that language brokers had scored higher on this measure of transcultural perspective-taking tasks, which suggests that practices that involve the mediation between cultural perspectives enhances the ability to see from different perspectives. Stated like that, it may seem not remarkable, but it's an answer to a question that is not typically asked in research with immigrant youth. What are the particular competencies that are cultivated in and through these experiences? So we might ask now, how could we foster these competencies in school? To suggest what's possible, I'd like to take you to B Club, the after-school program that has been the focus home for my research for the last 4 years. It's located in the heart of Los Angeles, a half a mile from the school where I began teaching on an emergency credential in 1983. It serves the children of immigrants from Mexico, Central America, the Philippines, the Middle East, Jamaica, and Bangladesh. Fewer of the latter few categories, but they're there. Also participating in the club are undergraduates from diverse social, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds. The school is surrounded by the signs and symbols of globalization, the juxtaposition of many different worlds. Within a few square blocks, you can buy pupusas, variedades, pan dulce, paletas, gourmet coffee, boba drinks, sushi, fast food hamburgers, Korean barbecue. There's a 99-cent store, a Payless shoe store, Taco Bell, a body slimming and contouring and hair rejuvenation center. The consulate generals of South Korea, China, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Bolivia are all housed nearby. And every day to get to school, kids pass by signs in English, Spanish, and Korean at least, and then they attend a school that offers 2 dual language programs, Korean English or Spanish English. And then they come to our program where translanguaging practices abound. This is a 5th dimension program envisioned originally by Mike Cole and established in LA by Chris. This is a place where culture is a verb and where learning happens through play, and especially play with linguistic border crossing. The program blurs the boundaries between school and out-of-school spaces. It offers 4 walls, some materials, a temporal structure to bring kids, undergraduates, and researchers into a setting where we can learn together Without the strictures and structures of schooling, we can experiment with different ways of teaching, learning, and being together. There's no mandated curriculum, no standards to achieve, no standardization of our diverse learning processes. We construct the community together and learn through play, and play with learning. On any given club day, you can see clusters of kids and undergraduates playing with writing and expressing themselves in a variety of genres, modalities, and forms, making things with paper, stickers, and recyclables, emphasis on creation of things, writing letters to each other, building relationships, and depositing those letters in our mail system, or sending them by email. Exploring places on a talking world globe. And I love to look at where kids, literally you can see, as Fred Erickson puts it, kids lighting up as they find connections to places in the world and learn about new places as well. They play with letters and sounds, blending and combining them in creative ways to make their own club names and pseudonyms for our research. They express themselves in multimodal forms and translate across modalities, and record all of it for research purposes with kids taking charge. All of these activities are designed to cultivate translingual, transmodal, transnational, and transcultural competencies. And we work with undergrads to think about how to mediate learning in these ways. Our focus is on opening up kids' understanding, revealing it to us, especially by asking questions rather than instructing, by giving kids plenty of room to be the experts, to display their translingual and transcultural competencies to us, and by brokering their cultural and linguistic knowledge with and for us, and to grow those competencies. So I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through some of the examples. I'm going to stay with the big picture of the argument. But I could show you very quickly a few examples. Princess Bubblegum explaining, using various cultural reference, not based on hot dogs and apple pie or mainstream, white stream norms, but different reference to explain Filipino food to an undergrad. Kids giggling. Oh, boy, my thing says... All right, so I'm going to show a character X who writes to the kids, and I could tell you about X's antics, including writing this multilingual letter, sending it to the kids to see how they respond. I could talk to you about Fina reading that letter without hesitation and treating it as normal. But I'll jump to the end and say the practices that we engage at B Club run counter to the dominant trends in educational research at this point in time. We're not trying to foster a common core of knowledge. We're not trying to get all kids to read, write, speak, think in following a predetermined set of standards like banners held on high, and that is the original meaning of the word standard. It's a conspicuous object used as a rallying point, especially in battle. We are trying, or a set of systems of weights and measures as established by the king. We are trying to build on the competencies that these youth have and that they develop from their everyday lives in these new immigrant contact rooms, to make room for the expression of these competencies and to support their growth and to follow their lead. I'm going to end with this. This planet is facing the greatest ecological crisis that has ever existed. Climate change is already causing huge new migrations of people around the globe. This will only heighten what Nikos Papastergiadis refers to as the turbulence of migration. The ethnocentric and nation-centric, and I might add egocentric, mindsets that have reigned in the colonial and post-colonial world limit our ways of working together to make real change. Even to have a chance to resolve these crises means we need to be able to dialogue with people who think and speak in very different ways. For that, we need to cultivate not commonality as much as flexibility, versatility, transculturality. Now more than ever, we don't need to lead children in nice, neat, normative pathways down an educational trajectory that will result in them thinking and being just like the adults who have created these problems. We need dynamic and creative thinkers who can think outside the boxes we have built and find solutions to the social, cultural, and planetary problems that we have bequeathed to them.
what does one do to gild the lily here, right? This has been an extraordinary session. Thank you, Chris, so much for putting it together, and especially for thinking that we need to reframe the whole question, that we are really in trouble if we do not begin to reframe the question. So I think these papers today have raised a number of questions for me, and I'm going to be very brief because probably you want to say some things too or ask some questions. But I was taken aback very much by the whole question of who is the we, right? And I want to take us to who is the we, because it's a question that's implied very definitely in the unfinished society issues that Ruben raised for us, right? And part of the considerations and much of the fear about the new group of people coming in is that it raises the question, who are we and who are we going to become? And are we still going to be the we of how we think of ourselves as Americans, if they've thought of this society, and how are we going to bring all of these people in and we can't see the future to see who this we will be? And that's a frightening thing of who the we is. And it's also a frightening thing when we talk about the young people and they begin to ask themselves, and who is the we here, right? And it's them and it's us, and it's very interesting as I hear about Mexicans, for example, and I'm one of these people who clearly am Mexican, and people will say to me sometimes, I didn't even notice you were Mexican, Guadalupe, right? And that's supposed to be some kind of a wonderful compliment. And I say, I would hope that that's the first thing you'd notice about me, that I am Mexican, right? Because we know that among Latinos, it's very important for people to tell you immediately, I'm Salvadorian, I'm Peruvian, I'm Argentinian, anything but Mexican, right? Because Mexican means something in this society today that we know people do not want to be. And I think Vilma has made it very clear that the racialization, what does race matter in this society, is very important. And we seldom ask it enough when we start talking about these issues. We really pretend in some ways that race actually is only an issue when we're talking about African background individuals, but that's not the case, right? So going back to the we, right, of saying, who are we here listening to this conversation? Okay. Who are we sitting in this room? And we're educational researchers, and we're educational practitioners, and we're those folks that I know that came to this session that care about the elephant, okay? That care about being certain, how do we work in this space when the structures are so incredibly immobile, right? And there are moments in which I feel the total hopelessness, and I work in my tiny little space, right? In a tiny little space trying to change something, a school that I work in, changes that I see in young people, and yet here I am in a large educational research organization with a great deal of power, and we have to face the question of how are we going to change education in the United States so that these young people that are coming in, okay, and so we have a very different future. And we've had some ideas. What would transcultural dispositions be? How do we get people to value their own intelligence? So I love the way all of these four papers fit together, that we see the massiveness of, I hate to say it, the problem, but the problem is definitely there. And what might be ways of moving in the direction of change, right? And how can we work in a particular space? And I have a very good friend, Ann Dyson, who would often say, just change the space where you work, right? And for some of us, we can do that. But there's sometimes when we worry about these standards, right? Okay? These reform efforts, these new labels for things these kids don't have. I've been waging a war here recently against academic language, and every time anybody uses the word, I basically say, what is it? Would you define it for me? It's imprecise. It's what those kids don't have, right? And it could be vocabulary one day, it could be the language of science another day, it could be, you name it, but they don't have it, right? And we're going to measure it, right? So the whole assessment industry, right, that must disturb us, okay? And I happen to think that there's enough of us here in the organization to be able to make some changes, to be able to start raising some questions that we're saying, and notice what Lee Patel told us about how are we able to help these kids defend themselves against a world by being able to see their own intelligence, okay? In important ways to be able to value, what does it mean to be intelligent? And you at least need to give them that suggestion of possibility, because it's lost otherwise. Because every single system that we have set in place, every single test, every single book that they must read, right? That hasn't really been written, okay? To take into account the strengths, okay? What they may bring that they already know, it's not there. It's really designed to help you see how you couldn't possibly make it. And what Vilma told us, and it was incredible to me that it really doesn't seem to be any progress over generations. That's serious, right? That's incredibly, incredibly serious. So I think that if I were going to say, what does this leave us with as educators? It would be the question of what can we do to change the world? We've been invited to think about transcultural dispositions. I love the concept, right? What would that look like if we really said where we must move to is to a world in which we value perhaps not how much we are like the Anglo-Americans that settled this country originally, but where we're moving to this new society, to this unfinished society, and to tap all of our strengths. Because very much as Marjorie said, right? This is a crucial time in the world. We need all the talent that we have. We cannot afford to waste a single child, a single young person, and say, what you bring to us does not matter. So thank you for inviting me to discuss these very important papers, and I then leave you here with how many minutes for discussion?
1 minute. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and I think that you certainly generated as many questions as information that you gave us. I mean, there's so much that we wish we had time to do, because Ruben, when you were talking about, Los Angeles, people are studying the super diversity and what comes with super diversity. And there's some wonderful work about, unfortunately, super diversity is now being equated with super poverty. What are the challenges and what are the new questions? There's so much that you raised for us to help us think differently, and I hope for those of you, especially the young scholars in the audience, I hope our message too was how important it was to look across disciplines to learn about the phenomenon of immigration, right? Educational scholars, but people also in other disciplines who are really seriously looking at it with using very different lenses. So I hope that's a message, especially to the young scholars, that we need to move out of our comfort zone and keep learning about the kind of work that our colleagues, Vilma and Ruben, are doing. And again, let's just thank them. I thought they were wonderful, and I wish we had so much more time because they had so much more to say. But thank you so much, all of you, for participating.
All right,
and you might be able to corner them while they're up here. I don't know the official time they kick us out.